Okie dokie, it's time to reassemble the gearbox. And we've got the gearbox sort of shell here, and we have the main shaft gear already inserted, and we have the layshaft needle roller bearing already inserted, which we did when before we put the crankcases together. Then we've got all the gearbox internals here, and we've got the gearbox casing there. So a few things to note before we get going. What I've done is I've laid all the gears out in the order that they go back in, hopefully, because by now I can kind of just about remember them. You've got the lay shaft here and the lay shaft gears. You've got the main shaft here and the main shaft gears, and you've got the selector rod there and the selector forks there, and you've got what we call the cam plate there, which we'll sort in a minute. And we've also got the lay shaft thrust washer there, and there's another thrust washer there we're not using yet. Oh, we've got a circlip as well. I'll put that in there because that needs to go on the end of the lay shaft later on. But order of assembly, I often put out this is the workshop manual and this is the parts catalogue. And between the two of them, if you're not sure the order of the gears going back in, you can generally work it out from these. These are in the right order. The only problem with these two diagrams is that they're reversed to each other. So on this one, the primary side is over here, and on this one, the primary side is at this end. So it can be a bit confusing. But it helps, certainly this one helps the order of putting the selector forks in. From the back, I always say SLS, so short, long, stubby. But we'll look at that in a minute. But they're helpful, but they are a bit confusing because they're the wrong way around and the bits are in the wrong place. So, I mean, for instance, we've got the, we did it on the last video, we put the oil seal carrier in. So we've got the carrier, the oil seal, and according to this, the gasket on the outside. Obviously, the gasket goes obviously before the oil carrier, not stuck on the outside of it. But you know, they're generally helpful. All right. Okay. So I'm going to mount the camera, and then we're going to go through in exact order the way that we're going to do things, which I shall just. I think I've got it right. I shall just briefly outline. We're going to put the thrust washer, we're going to glue it onto the back of the gearbox. We put some grease on the back and we're going to like glue it on the back with some grease. Then we're going to put the cam plate in. Then we're going to put the final drive in. And then we're going to slowly build up the two shafts with the selector forks in the right place. If you remember last time, I inspected the selector forks and decided that one was a bit worn, and indeed. So if you see, this is the new replacement, this is the old one, and you can see there's considerable wear there on that fork. We turn it over on the back, and again there's a fair bit of wear on the back as well. So I'm glad that we did change that fork. The other forks not showing much wear at all. So that's the old fork, which is short. That goes in first. Long goes in second. Stubby goes in last. But we'll come on to that. But yeah, so we've replaced that. I've checked all the other gears. I've checked for any signs of pitting or rust or anything like that, or chipped teeth and so on. Everything looks absolutely fine. I can't see any chipped teeth anywhere or any. Sometimes they get pitting. My gearbox last time I took it apart, and all the teeth were really badly pitted. Not sure what causes it, but advisable to replace in that instance. In this case, there's no pitting at all on any of the gears, so that's good. I didn't replace there's two needle roller bearings in the final drive gear here, so I didn't replace those because these two are absolutely fine, and to be honest, replacing them you can actually do more damage, you know, because unless you've got a proper press, trying to knock those roller bearings in without damaging them is difficult. So these two bearings seem absolutely fine, so I've left them as is. The only thing I've done is to replace the oil seal on the end of this final drive unit. Okay, and again, obviously, that's this side is the primary drive, and again, oil seal always the open side towards the oil. The gearbox is this side, so that's why we've got the open side that way, because we don't want the oil coming out of the gearbox. Over there's a kickstart, we'll come on to that later, and that's about it. So I'm going to mount the camera, and then bit by bit we're going to assemble the gearbox. Okay, here we go. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to put this thrust washer, and we're going to stick it around the needle roller bearing and the back of the gearbox, and the little hole in the thrust washer goes over the tiny little dowel that sticks out, and then the actual bearing holds the thrust washer in place. Great. Okay, I think the second thing we're going to do is we're going to put the cam plate in. Right, now I guess before we assemble the gearbox, I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to briefly explain how the gearbox works, because I think if you've got an understanding of how it works, it makes life a lot easier. So you've got there's the gear lever. You want to change gear, you move the gear lever up and down. On the other end of the gear lever are these plungers with sharp teeth, and when the gear's moved, one of them goes under the plate and the other one is allowed out from the plate, and that pings out. And these sharp teeth, when it pings out, the sharp teeth then engage with this end of the butterfly quadrant. The tooth comes out and goes into one of those, and then as the gear lever's moved, it rotates the quadrant just a little bit. Okay, at the other end of the quadrant are some more teeth here, and obviously when the other side is moved, this side then moves in the corresponding direction. All right, so then those teeth on the butterfly quadrant, they then engage with the teeth on this cam plate, as it's called, and the cam plate is moved round by the quadrant, moves it round. The cam plate has got these grooves cut in it, and these grooves are for the back end of the selector forks, and the selector forks sit in those grooves. And so then, as the cam plate is moved round, it then correspondingly moves the position of the selector forks. So these selector forks then are moved round by the cam plate, and they are attached to the gears, because the gears, some of them have got a groove in the back. And as the cam plates move round, so the selector fork moves the gear according to where the cam plate is. And because all the gears are together, as they're moved along the shafts, they engage with different gears, and so that's how the gears are changed. Right, so that's the basic workings of the gearbox, which I think we need to establish just so we've got some idea of what we're actually doing, rather than just putting things in and not really knowing why we're putting them in and what's happening. That's the basic operation of the gearbox. This is the plunger that I was referring to earlier on, and this screws up underneath the gearbox there, and the tip, and that goes on the end of the cam plate here, and those notches are where the gears are. So that will be first gear, and then you move the cam plate around and that will be neutral, second, third, fourth, and then almost unbelievably all the way around, a long gap is fifth, fourth, third, second, neutral, first. So as you move the cam plate around with the gear lever, it locks it into the next position. Okay, and so it's important to have this plunger working properly, and so it engages the gears nice and cleanly. Right, where were we? So we just put the thrust washer in. I'm going to loosely screw the plunger in for now, only loosely because I want to be able to turn the cam plate easily, and if I screwed it up too tight, then it makes the cam plate awkward to move around by hand. So I'm just screwing it in loosely, and then I'm going to put it in. Now what I've got is, I've just got a little tub of just a very small amount of gearbox oil, because a lot of these pieces are already got oil on, and unlike the engine, I'm going to fill the gearbox with oil straight away, so I don't need to worry about using assembly lube. Oh dear me, go again, as which I used to have to do on the engine, because we're going to fill the gearbox with oil straight away. There we go, we're just screwing that in loosely, and even then it's awkward to change. Right, so the first notch is first, so I want the gearbox in neutral, and that's the second notch on the cam plate. So that's first, so I'm turning it round so that notch is engaging with the plunger at the bottom. Second, neutral, second notch, neutral position, because that, in neutral position, we can then assemble the rest of the gearbox, because the selector forks, they like neutral, we can get everything in. If they're in gear, then it doesn't slot in. Right, so then I've got the cam plate in. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the gearbox high gear in, just one. There's already quite a bit of oil on the needle roller bearings inside, so that's okay, and there's also some oil on the actual final drive main bearing, but I'm just adding a bit just to make sure we're okay, and that simply slots in there. And later on, there we go, later on the back end of this high gear will go the actual gearbox sprocket that the chain goes on, but there's no need for us to put that on yet. Okay, then the next thing we put on is the gearbox main shaft. Now, so it's got a key and a taper at that end, which is what the clutch hub sits on. So it's going to go in that way. Again, I'm just going to put a little bit of oil on it. As I say, it's already got a fair bit of oil on. Now, before that goes on, we have to fit fourth gear on the main shaft. So that's fifth gear. This is fourth gear on the main shaft. So we have to fit it first, because it only comes on from that end. You can't slide it off the back end, which is annoying if you want to remove the cam plate, because you've got to take the whole thing off. Now the only way, which I've got to do with another gearbox, I want to get this gear off. The only way of doing it is by taking the whole primary chain case off, the gearbox sprocket, the clutch, the whole thing, and then you can take the main shaft out this side and get this gear off. Okay, and that's got a groove in it for the first of our selector forks, and I think that is our short. Yeah, so it's the short one. It's not long, it's not stubby, it's the short, and that goes in. Let me get this right. That sits in there. Right. I've got the selector fork round the wrong way. That's the main problem. That would help. I had it that way round, and it fits that way round. Best laid plans, and it fits, and so it hangs down, which is a problem for us, but never mind. Then it fits in. There's only one slot it will go in at the back there. Okay. Now the problem, the eternal problem. Can we see, how well can we see that? Fairly well, I think. Okay, now the eternal problem with this selector is that as we rebuild the gearbox, because it fits downwards, it keeps falling out of its hole, its slot in the cam plate. Okay, so one little kind of trick which probably won't work is having got that in position, and then going to turn the cam plate down into first, and that tends to hold that fork in position. And if we're lucky, we might get away with fitting the rest of the gearbox without that falling back out. If it does fall out, there's other ways of doing it. I've then got the lay shaft. We've got the lay shaft thrust washer already stuck in the back of the gearbox, and this is 5th and 4th gear. Yeah. Okay. So I'm checking that they're not interfering with each other. They can. The 4th gear should be totally free to spin and should not in any way foul on 5th gear, because otherwise they have been known, if they lock together, then you're trying to operate 5th and 4th gear at the same time with predictable results that you don't want to think about. Okay, so I think I can get that in now. Yeah, so that just simply sits in. There we go, one unit, and that locates with the main shaft. Okay, and we're in 1st gear, so they're both turning. Right, what's next? Okay, so I'm going to fit the next gear, which is on the lay shaft. Yeah, lay shaft. So it's lay shaft, must be 3rd gear this, yeah. And we've got the long selector fork. Long, this bit's long. And that goes on the lay shaft, and the fork goes upwards. So this time, when it goes against the cam plate, just make sure everything's together, then it can't fall down because it's leaning against the cam plate. The one on the other side is coming up from the bottom and it falls away. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and cheat a bit by getting half out of first, just a little bit out of first. Probably won't work. Won't work at all, I know. There, just sneaks it out of first a bit, just enough to slot that selector in, and both the selectors are now still in position. Then I've got main gear 3rd, is it? I think. Is that right? There we go. That's in. Good. Okay, what we got next? Then I think we've got 2nd gear on the lay shaft, which just goes on by itself. The holes you can generally work out because you've got tabs on some gears and holes on the other. So you can generally work out which is which way round they go. Yeah, I think that's okay. Okay, so that's combined 1st and 2nd gear, which goes on the main shaft. Then we've got 1st gear, that goes on the lay shaft. Right, yeah, so the plain side inwards with the last selector fork on. Again, this one goes in like from the top, leans in towards the cam plate. There we go. And again, we can't quite get it into the slot in the cam plate because it's in 1st gear. So I'm just going to half turn that cam plate a bit. Come on, turn a bit. There we go, just enough to slot that. And so that means that the selector fork at the back hasn't fallen out, because what normally happens is, because it comes in from underneath like that, it simply just falls down and sits like in the bottom of the gearbox. But because it's right at the back, you can't get to it to put it back in position. but we've cleverly sneaked it so that we're okay. What I used to do and still do now when that method doesn't work is what I do is I've got a magnet, telescopic magnet, and I put it down the end, and you can just get it on that fork and like lift it up and stick it back in position. Next, we've then got the layshaft, the selector fork shaft. Okay, so it's simply a steel shaft. It's got a flat at one end, and this flat is designed to go into the gearbox. And because the idea is that if there's any air in that, it's a blind hole, and the air can get out. So otherwise, the air sort of pushes it back out. So that simply slides in. It's still got some oil on it, so I'm okay with it, and it slides in, slots in nicely there, and holds the selector forks in. Then we're nearly there with the gearbox. Okay, I've got a pair of circlip pliers, and so then we've got the circlip, and this circlip goes on the layshaft. There's a groove for it just in front of gear. So it slides on, there we go, until it goes into that groove. And the very last thing we've got is the first gear dog, and this goes onto the shaft, and then you basically just need to find a location where it's not going to sit on the outside of the sort of dogs, but you turn it until it slots into, there we go, and that's it, that's the gearbox done. I shall now try and put it back into neutral if I can. There we are. Yeah. So I think it should be in neutral there. Okay. Got a phone call.